No one is untouchable, but there are a few Reds prospects who should only be traded in the rarest of cases.
You are Locked On Reds, your daily Cincinnati Reds podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Reds. My name is Jeff Carr, and I'm glad that you're alongside me today. I've loved the Reds since birth. Seriously, I've got the baby pictures to prove it, and I've been hosting this show now for 6 seasons, talking about your Cincinnati Reds on a daily basis for Locked On Reds that is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every single day, and we want to be available to you, no matter who you are, no matter what kind of baseball fan you are. We talk about the biggest things in Reds country, the biggest things on everybody's mind. We will dive into some geeky numbers, but I'll make sure that they make sense. And we'll talk about and overreact about the daily motions of the MLB Ocean, the long season that is. I'm glad that you're with me here today, because the more that I look into this Reds draft, I like it. It follows along with something Nick Krall talked about in 2022. Also, the Reds are fast becoming a factory for a certain position group, and that makes them a force at the trade deadline this year. And something Reds fans should definitely be buyers at is that trade deadline. But are there some untouchable prospects? No. But there's a big asterisk next to that. No, that's all coming up on this episode of Locked On Reds that is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. The right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your rivals. Check out Booking.com for your stay today. And where we want to start today is with the Reds' posture at the trade deadline, because I believe that they're buyers. And I don't necessarily know that it's about going all in for this one season, the traditional sense of the word buyer when it comes to the Reds, or when it comes to the MLB Trade Deadline. But I think that this is really the point where they begin to lock in next year. Make no mistake about it, I will be disappointed. And I'm sure that you will be disappointed if the Reds don't make the playoffs this year. But if they don't make the playoffs in 2025, hard questions will need to be answered. So they need to make sure that they're setting themselves up for this, because the Reds really have entered a period of time where they should not have a pearl clutching mentality when it comes to this trade deadline, as it's time to set the team up for some playoff success. You know, that could be for this year, but it should definitely be for next year. That being said, there are some prospects that may be close. They're not untouchable, but they may be close to untouchable. Like, it better be for a huge trade. Who are some of those people? We'll talk about that on today's show, because let's look at this. The Reds' top prospect rankings, and this is a consensus. This is not like I came up with these rankings myself. I looked at Baseball America, MLB Pipeline, ESPN, and Fangraphs, and I compiled all of their rankings together, and based on the averages of where all these players rank, this is how they fall. According to this consensus of these 4 websites, of which I kind of have the most trust in when it comes to prospect news, the number 1 prospect on the team is Rhett Lowder. The number 2 prospect on the team is Chase Petty. Edwin Arroyo is 3rd. Then you have the catcher, the very young catcher, Alfredo Duno, is the 4th highest prospect. Connor Phillips, and he's had a rough year, so this may change, but Connor Phillips is your 5th highest prospect. Cam Collier is number 6. Ricardo Cabrera, who is a shortstop, is number 7. Julian Aguilar, a pitcher and the Reds minor league pitcher of the year in 2023, he is the number 8 prospect. Ty Floyd, who was a pitching prospect that they drafted just last year, is number 9. And then third baseman Sal Stewart is number 10. Again, this is, a composite ranking of 4 different websites that really do a great job covering covering minor league baseball. And when I look at those rankings, you kind of get a feel for who should be almost untradeable. Like, if they're trading Rhett Lowder, they better be getting somebody real good. And it better not be Rhett Lowder and Edwin Arroyo and Julian Aguilar and Sal Stewart, because that feels like you're giving up the farm for somebody. And I also want to put a caveat in this as well. This is before any rankings include any draft picks. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but some believe that Chase Burns would be a top 3 prospect for the Reds this year. But I say all that to say, like, I really think that it's going to be hard-pressed to see Rhett Lowder get traded. Don't think we'll see Chase Petty be traded, although I may have a few thoughts on that coming up. Edwin Arroyo has been hurt all year. I'd be surprised if he's traded just because of the injury. And then you kind of look at some of these other guys on the list, like where are we at with Cam Collier? I think Cam Collier is a tradable prospect. Alfredo Duno is super young. Like, I think there might be some teams that are interested in maybe trading for somebody that young, but he is the highest rated catcher as far as Reds prospects go since Tyler Stevenson. Connor Phillips has had such a down year that the current ranking of number 5 in this organization may be falling quite quickly, and he may not be tradable. But if you're able to like throw him in a package and get somebody, that could be kind of interesting. But I look at those and I really don't think that any of those guys are untouchable. But if I'm trading like a Chase Petty or especially a Rhett Lowder, I better be getting back a Luis Robert. Luis Robert is most likely to be the most talented player traded at this deadline. And if the Reds are going to get him, they're probably going to have to offer somebody like Rhett Lowder or Chase Petty and some other people. It's going to be hard to stomach that, but could you set this outfield up for the next 3 years? That would be kind of tantalizing, I would think. I don't want to go too crazy with that and say, okay, we'll trade everybody. That's fine. We'll just get rid of everybody. But there's definitely some dudes up there who are available. I would say hard and fast, I don't think Rhett Lowder's getting traded at all. I don't think you'll see Arroyo. I don't think you'll see Duno. I don't think you'll see I don't think Chase Petty's getting traded. I think they're really happy with what he's looking like right now. Because I don't know that the Reds are going to go get Luis Robert. I think that's the only situation that guys like that are going to be traded for. And that's kind of the point, is that the Reds are at a point in their growth, the building, as it were. They're definitely not in teardown mode. If they trade anybody and if they are quote-unquote sellers at the deadline, it's going to be expiring contracts and relief pitchers, guys that aren't part of the core. They're not going to be a traditional seller, even if they do sell. But I also believe that they're at the point where, and we talked about this on an episode a couple of weeks ago, remember the trade and everything they had to give up to get Joe Morgan. Do you think they'd go back and take that trade back? Sure, they gave up a lot. And at the time, they were getting kind of, dragged in the media. There was a really scathing article in the Inquirer about that trade. But it worked out. Things like that probably are what the Reds have to do if they're going to go out and get a top flight player. Could you bring in Luis Robert for something like that? Because there's some questions about, his durability and stuff, but that's probably why you could get a guy like him who still has 3 years left of control. He has shown star potential, flashed it, not consistently, and he's not healthy enough for you to be like, yes, he's a bona fide top 10 baseball player right now, but he could be. Could the Reds be the team that unlocks that potential? And would that be worth giving up at Rhett Lowder? That's hard for me to say. I'd be interested, because I know that there's a lot of you get strong opinions about prospects. I understand that. Who do you think is untouchable? I'd be interested to hear from you. If you drop a thought down in the comments section, or you can hit me up on X at Jeff Carr with 3 Fs. And let's talk about this, because the trade deadline looms, and I believe whether or not the Reds are going for this year's playoffs, their plan for building for next year should begin now. If it helps out this year, great, but it better help out next year. And this is when you start. Because you might be able to go get yourself, a nice Brent Rooker. Like I keep wanting him to go get. But they cannot have a pearl clutching mentality about this. That doesn't necessarily mean I want them to sell the farm, though. But, we're just getting started here on today's episode because the Reds organization is fast becoming a factory for a particular position group that makes it easier to trade someone from said group. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more can be found there. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, your bunny and rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And as the Major League Baseball regular season resumes coming up here this weekend, the best way to get down to the ballpark is with Game Time because they've got the last minute tickets at the lowest prices guaranteed. Seriously, as you get closer to first pitch, the prices go down. Plus, they've got a couple of great features for you, all in pricing so that the number that's listed next to the tickets that you want is the number that you pay. It's not like, oh, hey, look, it's $8, and then it gets bumped up another $5 or $6 or even $10 with fees. Game Time gives you the all-in price. Plus, if you go to a stadium that you've never been before, they give you a view from your seat, even panoramic. You can look around and see exactly what your surroundings will look like. Check out Game Time today. Download the app and use the promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's Game Time and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. They've got the last minute tickets and the lowest prices on them guaranteed. You've got to check out Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 streaming channel that brings you the biggest news and stories in sports. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and more, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And speaking of every day, shout out to our everydayers out there. Thank you for making Locked On Reds part of your day, whether it's your commute or your workout or your chores, whatever it is that you're doing. Thank you so much for taking us along with you. For our everydayers, coming up on the next Locked On Reds podcast, we'll get you ready for the National Series that begins the last gasp toward the playoffs. That's coming up this weekend. But let's get back to the whole trade deadline-ness of today's show. I talked about the Reds should be buyers. There might be some players that are going to be hard for them to trade, but nobody's untouchable. But quite frankly, when it comes to the trade deadline, there is a common desire for selling teams, and that is good pitching prospects. Something the Reds have a lot of. Back on those rankings again, I told you about the top 10. What's that, 5? Yeah, half the top 10 are pitchers, which is a fantastic number to look. And then you also see that, right outside the top 10, based on the composite rankings that I had, you had another 6 pitchers, sorry, I can't count. Looking at my own notes here. But another 6 pitchers in the next 10. They have a ton of pitching depth to deal from. Plus, when you consider the fact that Chase Burns is believed to be a top 3 prospect, by a lot of folks have said that, in this Reds organization, and some even think that Luke Holman, the second-round pick out of LSU, right-handed pitcher, could be in the Reds' top 10 as well. You could be seeing the top 10 that's 7 out of 10 pitchers. So they've got some depth to deal from. They could conceivably, and I'm not advocating that they just go out and trade Rhett Lowder and Chase Petty, but you could conceivably go out and trade Rhett Lowder and Chase Petty, but you're not really going to hurt your pitching prospect depth that much. because of the guys that you're bringing in. Frankly, I think what happens is they trade one of those two guys. I think if it comes down to it, they probably trade Chase Petty. But if you trade Chase Petty, then you have Rhett Lowder, who is probably ready next year, and Chase Burns, who Keith Law, noted Reds detractor, and a couple of other folks have said could be ready next year. You could be infusing the rotation with two, not one, but two great young arms with a lot of upside. So you don't necessarily have to worry about, damaging the pitching prospect capital of the Reds organization. But even think about this, because you could conceivably hold on to both those guys and trade like a Julian Aguilar. Or you could trade, Ty Floyd, or even Connor Phillips. I don't necessarily know what his value would be in a trade right now because of all the struggles he's gone through this season. We talked about them a little bit in case you haven't been here for any of that. He has struggled mightily. He's walked as many people as he's struck out in AAA. And he's in the Arizona Complex League right now trying to work on whatever it is ails him. It's not because he's hurt. It's just because he's been super ineffective this year. But I really feel like that's where this Reds organization is. Because consider this too. Like I said, the idea that the Reds are a pitching factory. I think that they're pretty much there. Probably need 1 or 2 more years for the rest of the league to really recognize that. But it's really hard for a major league organization to be masters of developing every position. There are certain teams where you're like, okay, that's a middle of the infield type team. That's a catcher team. That's an outfield team. Things like that. Because if you can master developing one position and you get a ton of great quantity to go with that great quality, then you are known as a factory for that position, because the Reds have a lot of good pitching talent. And based on, Burns and Holman and a couple of other guys that they've picked, they have a lot of guys that have some pretty decently high floors, as well as guys that have really high ceilings, a lot of upside. They're coming from a great position in that they're coming out of college, they're coming out ready to go, and then Derek Johnson gets a hold of them and just makes them great. And I know right now, we're seeing that step forward. We haven't seen the apex of either Hunter Green or Nick Lodolo's career, but we are seeing that step forward right now. Can you imagine where they could be at their apex, at their prime? Could you imagine 5 guys like that were all developed by the Reds? Because that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because not every prospect pans out. But the way that the Reds are developing talent right now for pitching leads me to believe that other teams look at the Reds and say, if you want this nice shiny Brent Rooker for your outfield, let's talk about Chase Petty. Or let's talk about Rhett Lowder. Okay, you don't want to talk about, well, Julian Aguilar looks pretty good too. And maybe we pair somebody else with Julian Aguilar and we get a deal done. Things like that. That's an oversimplification. I understand that. But the whole point is, with the Reds getting to this point where we can confidently say, I can confidently say it. I'm sure that there's going to be some folks push back on this and say, well, they're not there yet, but they've got the makings of this. But I think the Reds are a pitching factory. And I think that's going to make it easier to trade pitching prospects to get what they need. Because sure, it's great to have a good pitching staff and good pitching depth, but there is a certain point where you can take a little bit of that depth and turn it into, the outfielder that the team desperately needs. They could go get a bona fide relief pitcher for the rest of the way, or maybe with another year of control or something like that. I think there's a lot that they could work with from this pitching, from the organizational depth that they have at pitcher. And we still have a little bit more to get to in today's show because the Reds had a clear theme in the rounds that followed the first round of the MLB draft, and that made their draft just that much more exciting. This episode of Locked On Reds is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah, With summer travel heating up, especially travel to baseball games, it's time to explore U.S. cities that you always secretly wanted to learn more about. Yes, we're talking about those rival cities like Pittsburgh and St. Louis and Chicago and Milwaukee, because Booking.com has hotels, beds and breakfasts, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more in all of those cities, and all of them near the ballpark. They make it so easy to find your perfect stay, even in your baseball rivals' cities. They've got hotels looking over stadiums. They've got family-friendly resorts. They've got so much more. Booking.com has so many choices across the U.S. and summer travel for the rest of this Major League Baseball season, because the right stay can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your rivals. Book today at Booking.com on the website or use the Booking.com app. And the best way to take advantage of the rest of the baseball season and really enjoy watching baseball is with Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. It's so easy to see why they're #1, because you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks. All you need is as little as 4 correct picks in an entry, and you could turn $10 into $1,000. And Prize Picks has some awesome promos. They have one on Tuesdays where they lower select players' stats to make it easier for your picks to hit. Or they have one on Fridays where you can get your entry fee back if your lineup doesn't win. All you need to do is pick your favorite players like Ellie De La Cruz and Hunter Green, find your favorite stats, and click more or less. Before the games return, Prize Picks also has a few stats for Ellie the rest of this season. In the final 66 games, they have Ellie's steal total for that time period at 21.5, and they've got his homer total at 10.5 for those final 66 games. I mean, come on. Click more on both of those. So download the Prize Picks app today and use the promo code, all lowercase, LOCKEDONMLB for up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Again, code LOCKEDONMLB, all lowercase, will get you an instant deposit boost of up to $100 for your first deposit. Pick more or pick less. It's that easy. You can catch every pitch of the Reds' hometown broadcasts with SiriusXM. Just download the SXM app and search the word Reds, and you can listen to the game anywhere. Also, bookmark CincinnatiRedsTalk.com for written content about your Cincinnati Reds. I actually had an article that went up there yesterday talking about the draft and my thoughts on the draft, because the Reds landed not one, but 2 players who held the distinct first-round talent tag before they actually played their last collegiate season. So, before the 2024 college baseball season, Luke Holman and Mike Sirota, an outfielder from Northeastern, both were looked at as first-round picks. Both of them had a little bit substandard seasons, nothing crazy, and not a huge drop-off in production that makes you think, why on earth did the Reds draft them? But because of their final seasons in college, they fell to the second round in the case of Luke Holman, and to the third round in the case of Mike Sirota. Sirota's interesting case as well, an outfielder from Northeastern, so smaller school in a smaller conference, not like an SEC school or something like that, where everybody's looking at him, everybody's watching him. And he actually was kind of coveted by some of my counterparts at different Locked On shows as the draft went along. They're like, oh man, I really hope they pick up this guy. And then the Reds got him in the third round. There was other Locked On hosts that were talking about Mike Sirota at the early second round, and the Reds were able to get him when they did. But it kind of felt like a theme. And in fact, there were a couple of different reviews looking at the draft that really liked what the Reds did. And the first one that I saw, and this one really caught my eye, obviously, because of the grade that they gave the Reds, was CBS. CBS Sports gave the Reds the grade of A. Said that they don't know that any other team secured more name players, like guys that you knew or guys that scouts had really loved, than did the Reds. So they've got a bunch of value, and there's some guys that they need developing, they need some work, but like they mentioned that Chase Burns was a very high end pitcher, like the best pitcher in the draft, and there's been a lot of people outside of him, I was looking at some different assessments of the draft that said that in some years, Chase Burns would have went number 1 overall. But they believed because of the top end, the top heavy nature of the college hitters like Bazana and Charlie Condon and Nick Kurtz and those guys, that's why the way the draft fell is how it went. Because Chase Burns isn't necessarily a Paul Skeens, where he's a can't-miss number 1 obvious player, but he is along those lines. They could see that happening based on his stuff and based on his profile as a pitcher. And then you also had the review over at ESPN.com from Kylie McDaniel. Kylie McDaniel, very well-respected prospect writer and college baseball writer, really talking a lot about, the future of baseball and stuff. And he really liked a lot about what the Reds did. He had Luke Holman as their best value and the sleeper to watch, Mike Sirota, the two guys I mentioned, but said that the Reds are really sold around building their organization with power arms, power pitching. There's a lot of young guys in the system that can really throw. And it's going to be a lot of fun to see some of them come up. But like I mentioned a moment ago, with all these different guys and all this different talent, you're going to be able to trade from that surplus. A lot of people understand what Nick Carl is doing. And and I know we started this last week, and I know we started it on Friday, it wasn't on Thursday, but kind of the way I wanted to wrap up today's episode was with a Thursday thought. I always mention that, or I mentioned when I came up with this idea last week, is that when it comes to a Thursday thought, it's not necessarily something that I could ever lead a show with. It's not necessarily something that's going to be on the forefront of your mind, but it's kind of one of those things that as you're at a ball game, maybe you got a hot dog and a cold one in your hand, you're watching, it's like the 5th inning, and it's a pitcher's duel or something like that, and your mind's racing a little bit. This is a thought that I have because this draft was really something that Nick Krall talked about a couple of years ago. He has been true to his word whenever it comes to building this roster. Because if you think about it, 2022 stunk. One of the worst years in the history of this franchise. But what happened before that season began was a very important development for the future of this franchise. Because Nick Krall restructured the developmental staff of the Reds before that season. It was really the only thing he did that offseason. And do you remember the comment? Because everybody remembers the peaks and valleys comment, right? They remember that line that he gave and how ridiculously out of place it sounded. And especially when you take it out of that story, it sounds even crazier. But in the context that he said it, it had to do with the fact that he was building the developmental staff of the Reds so that no matter what kind of young kid that they brought in, if they traded for a prospect, if they drafted a prospect, they could get the best out of that guy. It's not something that the Reds have been known for over the past 30 years. Probably, maybe right up there with just not spending money. Probably the biggest reason why they have been so very unsuccessful. And he understood that. Think about this. There are now 25 total people in the development department alone for the Reds front office. Their entire job, 25 different people, their entire job is developing young talent. There are 5 people at the head of the Reds front office, along with Nick Krall, that lead the development side of things for the Reds. So essentially, you've got 30 people in charge of developing the future Reds roster. I'd say that's pretty good. As much as 2022 sucked, Nick Krall set up the future plan for the roster back then. That's why this Reds draft, that's why the Reds draft the way that they do. So they can corner the market on pitching development and build a winning pitching staff that they can then trade from the surplus. In fact, there's a lot of that idea that comes from the Cleveland Guardians. The Cleveland Guardians, that's always been their MO. They've been able to develop so many pitchers. I mean, it seems like Shane Bieber is not going to be long for the Guardians, for the, his career. He's probably going to move on somewhere else, but now they got Tanner Bybee. And before Shane Bieber, they had, a bunch of other guys. Like, they continually churn out good pitching. If the Reds can turn into that and do what the Guardians are doing, one of the best teams in baseball right now, then Nick Krall will look very smart. He's taken a lot of hits this year, and rightfully so. The roster has taken so many hits. The depth has been tested to a point that I think that it's failed. And so a lot of people have questioned just how good Nick Krall is at his job. But I think as these players that were just drafted develop, and as other players like Rhett Lowder and Chase Petty, Julian Aguiar and Alfredo Duno, Ricardo Cabrera and Sal Stewart and Cam Collier and Edwin Arroyo, and I just named most of the top 10 prospects, whatever, as they continue to develop, the whole peaks and valleys comment's going to make a lot more sense. That's how we're going to end today's podcast, though. A little bit of a Thursday thought for you, because I love that draft, and I love the fact that it flowed from what Nick Krall said a couple of years ago. Thank you so much for making Locked On Reds part of your day. If you're not an everydayer and you got to this point, I encourage you to become an everydayer. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Remember, you can take us with you anywhere you go with your favorite podcast app. You don't have to just watch us on YouTube, but thank you if you do watch us here on YouTube. Make sure you drop a thought down in our comment section if you haven't already done so. Let us know that you're watching. Give us your thought on the Reds as the second half, quote unquote. It's not really the second half, but as the final 66 games of the season are about to begin this weekend. And we will be with you every single day along the way here on Locked On Reds. And coming up on the next podcast, we'll get you ready for the National Series this weekend, because we are Locked On Reds every single day.